I work for a small tech company and get along pretty well with my boss, Dave. He's one of those easygoing, friendly guys, so when he invited me to go on a cruise with his family, I didn't think twice. It was going to be a 5-day trip, just to get away from the daily grind. He brought along his wife, Karen, and his teenage son, Alex. Alex was about 16, a good kid, but you know how teenagers are, quiet and always on their phone. The first few days of the cruise were amazing. The food was great, the weather was perfect, and we had a good time exploring the different stops. There was plenty to do on board: swimming pools, game rooms, shows. Alex mostly kept to himself, hanging around the pool and meeting a few other kids his age. Everything seemed perfect. Then one night, things took a dark turn. I remember going to bed around midnight. My cabin was a couple of doors down from Dave's family suite. I was pretty tired after a long day in the sun, so I fell asleep quickly. The gentle rocking of the ship made it easy to drift off. At around 1:30 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud knock on my door. Groggy and confused, I stumbled out of bed, wondering what was going on. When I opened the door, there was Dave, his face pale and his eyes wide with panic. "Has Alex come back to your room?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What? Why would he be here?" I replied, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. Dave looked at me with a mix of fear and confusion. "He never came back to our room after dinner. We thought maybe he crashed here or with one of the other teens." Immediately, I felt a knot form in my stomach. Something was wrong. We both quickly got dressed and headed to the ship's customer service desk. Dave's wife, Karen, had already called them, but now we needed to make sure a full search was underway. They took it seriously, of course. A teenager missing on a cruise ship is no joke. Within minutes, they announced a search over the loudspeaker, and a team of staff started combing the decks. The ship was massive, like a floating city, so finding someone on it wasn't an easy task. We searched everywhere: the pool deck, the restaurants, the game rooms, the theaters, but there was no sign of Alex. As the hours passed, panic set in. I could see it in Dave and Karen's faces, and to be honest, I was feeling it too. This was supposed to be a fun, relaxing trip. How did it turn into a nightmare so fast? By 3 a.m., the ship's crew suggested we start checking some of the closed-off areas, the empty rooms and parts of the ship that weren't being used. It was a long shot, but at that point we were desperate. We split into groups, each of us assigned to a different part of the ship. I ended up with one of the ship's security guards, a big guy with a stern face. We started going through the empty rooms one by one. Most of them were completely dark, the lights off, the beds made. It was eerie how quiet it was. The only sound was the hum of the ship's engines in the background. Then, just as we were about to call it quits, we opened a door and found him. Alex was sitting on the floor, his hands tied behind his back with rope, his mouth gagged with a dirty cloth. His eyes were wide with terror. For a moment, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was like something out of a horror movie. We rushed to untie him, and as soon as the gag was out of his mouth, he started crying. "He told me not to say anything," Alex stammered, barely able to get the words out. "He said if I told anyone, he'd kill my family." "Who?" I asked, my heart pounding. "Who did this to you?" Alex looked around nervously, as if the man might be standing right behind us. A man dressed in black. He grabbed me when I was walking back to the room. He dragged me in here and tied me up. The fear in his eyes was unmistakable. This wasn't some prank or misunderstanding. Someone had deliberately taken him and threatened him, and that someone was still on the ship. We immediately called security, and they locked down the area. They started reviewing security camera footage, trying to find any sign of the man Alex had described. Meanwhile, Dave and Karen were beside themselves with relief and terror. They couldn't believe what had just happened to their son. Then, things took another unexpected twist. The next morning, after hours of reviewing footage and interviewing staff, security identified a suspect. It was someone we all knew, a guy from our company. I couldn't believe it. He was just a quiet guy from the accounting department. We'd had drinks with him the night before, and he seemed completely normal. But there he was, caught on camera lurking around the empty parts of the ship, following Alex. When security brought him in, he didn't even try to deny it. He just sat there staring at the ground as they cuffed him and handed him over to the authorities at the next port. It turned out he had some sort of grudge against Dave. He thought kidnapping Alex would scare Dave and ruin him. But he didn't count on the ship's security and cameras catching him. Even now, months after the cruise, I still think about that night. The way the ship felt so peaceful and safe, only to turn into a place of fear and danger. And that quiet guy from accounting, someone I would have never suspected, planning something so twisted. I'm not sure I'll ever be able to set foot on a cruise ship again. The ocean may be vast, but nowhere is safe when you don't know what kind of monsters might be hiding in plain sight. My name is Shelby. My late husband, Antonio, was the best thing that ever happened to me. Long story short, he passed away in a motorcycle accident exactly 8 years ago as I'm writing this. What I'm about to tell you is something I've blocked out of my mind since it happened, but I think I'm finally ready to open up about it. Antonio and I both grew up in Italy. English is actually my second language. He always dreamed of traveling to Greece, but we kept postponing the trip. One of my biggest regrets was not taking time off work one summer to go with him. In late spring of 2018, I decided to bite the bullet and take the trip he had always talked about. Being only 36 years old with no children, I didn't like the prospect of traveling alone, so I decided to book a cruise, thinking it would be more relaxing. I was actually in luck. Celebrity Cruise Line had a Best of Greece cruise that covered 6 cities: Athens, Santorini, Ephesus, Mykonos, Volos, Thessaloniki, and then back to Athens. I tried my best to be excited about the cruise, knowing it was what he would have wanted, but I couldn't help but find the whole thing somewhat melancholy. It just felt wrong to be there without him. Admittedly, I may have gotten a little too wine drunk the first night after leaving Athens, but I felt I was entitled to behave less prudently. After exiting the boat and enjoying the city's offerings, I found myself drinking endless martinis at some nameless bar. That's when I noticed him across the bar. There was a man, about 40 years old, with long, straight brown hair and an unkempt beard. He wasn't bad-looking, actually, but his stare was unsettling. At first, I brushed it off as the wandering gaze of some lonely guy. Maybe he found me attractive. I wasn't going to get offended if he wanted to look at me. After catching his eye a few more times, though, I started feeling unease set in. The way he was glaring at me was just so perturbing. It wasn't seductive or charming, like he was trying to flirt or anything like that. It was literally as if he was trying to sear a hole in my face with his eyes. I finished what must have been my 8th drink, paid my tab, and quickly made my way back to the dock. By that night, my memory of that man had completely dissipated. The next city on the docket was Ephesus. My time there was essentially spent the same way, consuming far more alcohol than was acceptable for a woman my age. Other than some fleeting guilt, everything went well in Ephesus. Mykonos was next, and near the end of the day I unavoidably found myself sitting alone at an outdoor bar. That's when I noticed him again. There was a man standing against a light fixture with his arms crossed. I strained my eyes, thinking my mind must have been playing tricks on me. It was unmistakable, though. It was the guy from Santorini. He was too far away for me to tell whether he was looking at me, but his head was tilted in my direction. Oddly, he was wearing the exact same outfit he had worn in Santorini. A wave of discomfort washed over me. Was I being stalked? My palms began feeling clammy, so I nervously rubbed them on my dress as I lowered my head, trying to avoid looking in his direction. I could feel his aura radiating, though, even from that far away. I couldn't help myself. I glanced back up, but he was gone. You might expect my body to have flushed with relief, but I was actually even more anxious. I frantically began looking around, trying to see if he had gotten closer. I didn't feel comfortable walking back to the boat alone, so I ran into a couple that was leaving, made some small talk, and then walked back with them. That night, instead of retiring to my stateroom, I decided to explore the boat in hopes of running into that strange man. After scouring the boat in its entirety, I gave up around midnight. The next morning, I got off the boat in Volos, determined to solve this mystery. Instead of venturing into the city, I opted to wait at the gangway. I watched painfully for an inordinate amount of time as person after person made their way off the ship. I didn't miss a single one, but he wasn't one of them. Frustrated, I returned to the ship and spent the rest of the day by the pool. Thessaloniki was the last city. As much as I dreaded it, I had to reconcile with the fact that I'd be wasting my vacation if I stayed on the boat. So reluctantly, I got off the ship and tried to enjoy the city. Feeling superstitious, I thought it might be best to avoid bars and alcohol this time around, which I did. Instead, I wandered the streets aimlessly, admiring the architecture and enjoying the weather. And then, as if on cue, there he was again. He was a few streets down in the middle of the road, with his arms at his sides. Instead of being afraid, I felt a huge rush of adrenaline-induced confidence start to pour in. I yelled out to him and began walking in his direction. Instead of acknowledging me, he actually turned and ran. It was bizarre. He turned a corner and I chased after him. I made it to the corner and barely saw him run down another street, so I sprinted to follow him. I turned the same corner, and he had disappeared. Nowhere to be seen, like he had evaporated out of existence. I couldn't sleep that night. I was relieved when the ship pulled into Athens, but once I made it back home, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling of that man weighing on my mind. I whipped out my laptop and started doing research. I wasn't quite sure what to even look for, but I thought recent police reports were a decent place to start. After having no luck, I stumbled upon some missing persons advertisements. I scrolled through page after page and then I found something. There, in the middle of the page, was a missing persons ad for a guy who looked almost identical to the one who had been following me. I stared, frozen in shock. What was even more disturbing, though, was his name. He had the same first name as my Antonio, which was a cruel coincidence. The very first thing I did was call the police and report my sightings. The operator thanked me for my assistance and put me on hold. A few minutes later, she asked if I was 100% confident in what I had seen. I told her yes. After an uncomfortable pause, she went on to say that they had actually closed that man's case just over a month ago. Apparently, he had been found dead in a boating accident off the coast of Parga, Greece. What's more sinister, though, is that the date of his confirmed death was the exact month and day of my husband's passing, just 2 years later. I hung up the phone, literally shivering. I don't think I've ever been more terrified than I was at that moment. I began feeling dizzy, questioning if maybe I was going crazy. Had I imagined everything? Suddenly, another wave of realization slapped me in the face. The only city I hadn't seen him in, Ephesus, was actually a city in Turkey, not Greece. I'm not a believer in the paranormal, but I've spent hours trying to rationalize my sightings, and no conclusion I reach makes sense. My niece, Maria, had her wedding in Athens last summer, though, so I had no choice but to return. And like clockwork, there he was again. I only saw him for a split second this time, standing in that same outfit by the bar, head pointed in my direction. To be completely honest with you, there were so many drunk people there that I might have imagined it. Either way, I vowed to never step foot in Greece again. A few hours ago, something weird happened that I still can't explain. I live in Halifax, Nova Scotia, near the coast. My friend told me about a big sea buoy that somehow washed up on the shore, and no one seems to know how it got there or why it drifted so far from its usual spot. I didn't question it much, but he said he wanted to take some pictures. I hadn't talked to him in a while because he didn't really like the friends I spent time with, but school was over for the week and it was a good time to hang out, so I went along with him. The beach was a few kilometers away, but I thought the walk would be good exercise, so I didn't mind. About 30 minutes later, we met up and walked together for about 45 minutes. We chatted a bit as we walked over the snow and seaweed. Now, I should mention that there are many tall towers lining the beach, stretching on for kilometers, but they didn't look like communication towers. My dad works for the military, but he acts strange when I ask about them, almost like he's hiding something or not telling the whole truth. There was a cliff ahead, so we decided to climb it to get a better view of the beach and maybe spot the buoy. As we made our way up, we didn't notice that the weather was changing. It got really foggy and cloudy, and there were no birds flying overhead, no animals around, no cargo ships in the distance. Everything was completely still. We didn't realize how strange it was at the time because we were too focused on finding the buoy. When we reached the top, my friend's phone lost connection. It kept freezing and resetting by itself for no reason. He told me that it's a common problem with phones when it gets too cold. We looked around, but we didn't see the buoy or anything alive, so we decided to head back and call it a day. It was getting really cold, and we wanted to get back. My friend tried to take a picture of himself sitting on the cliff before we left, but his phone suddenly died right before he could take the picture. As we were heading back, we saw some light shining through the clouds. It looked really beautiful, so my friend decided to try his phone again and take a picture. Suddenly, I had this strange feeling like someone was watching us, so I turned around and saw a man slowly walking toward us. For some reason, he was getting closer quickly. I warned my friend that the man had appeared out of nowhere. We would have seen him from the cliff, so there was no way he could have been out of our sight. My friend looked at the man from a distance and then looked at me. He said he couldn't see the man's face. At first I thought he was joking, but then I saw he wasn't lying. Then, we heard a loud, terrible screeching sound from beside us. It sounded like a metal saw scraping against a screaming person. We decided to run as fast as we could. After about a minute of running, I looked back and saw the man walking behind the fence. He was technically trespassing because it was military property, but there's no way he didn't know it was trespassing, since there were signs everywhere warning about it. Once he started heading back on the road, away from the beach, my friend's phone started buzzing with notifications from social media. Birds returned, flying overhead, and we could see cargo ships sailing around in the distance. It felt like everything was back to normal. The phone was probably blocked because of the towers. If they were communication towers, they might block phone signals for safety reasons, especially in areas like that. After that strange experience, my friend and I decided it would be best to head home. We didn't want to stay any longer, especially after everything that had happened. We both really wish we had more proof to help explain what happened, but all we have are the details. It's frustrating because, without the pictures, it's hard to make sense of it. I don't check my phone much, so I didn't notice right away, but when I finally looked at it, I found that it had broken on its own. It wasn't dropped, and there was no reason for it to stop working.